She didn't walk into the ballroom. She was summoned into it, pulled beneath chandeliers that burned like judgment, and a silence that felt engineered for humiliation. The kind that tightens around a room until every breath feels rehearsed, and every pair of eyes is waiting for someone to fail. Stay with us, because this story will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. 200 faces turned toward her at once. Not with curiosity, not with kindness, but with that practiced stillness wealthy crowds use when something unscripted is about to unfold, and they are prepared to witness it. Not as participants, but as judges. The woman in the red gown stood across from her beside the grand piano, posture regal, smile polished into a weapon. The kind of smile that allows cruelty to masquerade as culture. "If you're going to stand there," she said, her voice drifting across marble floors like a silk thread tightening around a throat, "then prove you belong there." The murmurs did not ripple outward. They coiled inward. A few guests laughed softly, the polite kind of laughter that exists so people can deny its cruelty later, while phones lifted with the quiet confidence of an audience certain they already knew how this story would end. They weren't here for music. They weren't here for beauty. They were here for confirmation. Proof that the world was arranged exactly as they believed it should be. If she refused, they would nod and say, of course, some people misunderstand where boundaries are drawn. If she accepted and failed, her humiliation would live far beyond this room. Preserved, replayed, transformed into a lesson about people who should never have tried. The trap was not the piano. The trap was the story already written for her. She stood in a black dress that looked too simple for a place like this, and therefore too bold. Hands relaxed at her sides, posture steady in a way that unsettled a few onlookers because it did not match the role they had silently assigned her. Someone whispered, "She must be staff." Another voice answered, "Then she shouldn't be standing there." They spoke as if her presence was an error that needed correcting. The woman in red stepped closer, diamonds flaring under the chandelier light, tilting her head with an expression shaped to resemble concern. "Of course," she added gently, "if you'd rather step away, we understand. Not everyone is ready for a moment like this." The room softened, not in mercy, but in anticipation, relieved at the prospect of an exit that would restore the order they preferred. The security guard near the column paused, not in authority, but in recognition. The recognition of someone who has seen dignity tested before. Yet he remained silent, because men like him are paid to witness power, not interrupt it. A phone lifted higher. "This will go viral," someone whispered. "If she tries." The grand piano gleamed between them. An altar, a barrier, a measuring device built not only for sound but for hierarchy. To them it symbolized culture. To her it was memory and truth. The smile on the woman in red slipped for a moment, revealing impatience beneath refinement. "Well," she asked quietly, the single word slicing cleaner than a shout. The hush hardened into pressure. Camera lenses glinted like watchful eyes. Her silence, deliberate, gathered, was mistaken, as always, for hesitation. They saw a woman deciding whether to risk humiliation. They did not see the years of swallowed words, of doors closed politely, of survival purchased with silence. A memory surfaced, a pair of tired hands guiding hers over worn keys, a voice saying, "You don't owe them performance, but don't let them teach you to disappear." It did not soften her expression. It anchored it. She understood the design of this moment. It was never about whether she could play. It was about whether she was allowed to stand here without proving she deserved to. A woman in silver whispered, "If she walks away, this ends the right way." The right way, the expected way, the way that keeps the world tidy. The woman in red smiled again, luminous and false. "We don't want to embarrass you," she said, which was how people like her always introduced embarrassment. The choice narrowed until it was no choice at all. Step back and vanish politely, or step forward and give them the failure they came to witness. The chandeliers hummed. The marble seemed to tilt. The room leaned toward her like a closing mouth. She lifted her chin, not defiantly, simply truthfully. And for one brief, unsettling heartbeat, before she moved, before the room understood what kind of story it was standing inside, something shifted beneath the glittering light. And for the first time, the question hovering over the crowd was no longer whether she belonged beside the piano, but whether the room was ready for what would happen if she did. By the time the applause of Crystal and whispers from the ballroom faded behind her memory, what remained was not the chandelier light or the crowd's judgment, but the weight of the day that had carried her to that moment. The hours that existed outside marble floors and polished shoes, in places where voices were softer and choices were heavier, where silence wasn't performance, but survival. That morning had begun beneath fluorescent lights that hummed like tired insects, in a hospital corridor where the smell of antiseptic and metal clung to the air, and the walls listened to too many stories that all sounded the same. She had sat on a plastic chair with her hands folded in her lap the same way they would be later that night. Except here, the stillness wasn't a shield, it was exhaustion. Beside her, a woman's breath rose and fell beneath a thin blanket, tubes feeding machines that blinked like distant city windows at dawn. Her mother's voice, once warm and unbreakable, came out smaller now, fragile like glass that had been polished too many times. "Did they say anything new?" she asked, and the nurse, with a kindness that felt careful and inadequate, shook her head and said the appeal had been denied again, that they would have to talk about alternate payment options, that alternate payment options meant numbers that looked less like money and more like a sentence. The paper rustled in her hand as though even it wanted to apologize. 48,000. 48,000 was not a price. It was a wall. She nodded because nodding was what people did when they couldn't afford to collapse in front of other people's gentleness. Later, at home, the kitchen table was a battlefield of envelopes and silence, a stack of letters lined like little white doors she did not want to open, each one containing a reminder that hope in this world came itemized. Next to them lay a thin binder filled with sheet music, corners worn, pages yellowed, not from neglect, but from devotion that had learned to live quietly. Ink marks and penciled phrases curved across the margins, where younger versions of herself had written reminders, breaths, crescendos, promises. Once, professors had leaned over those same pages and told her she had a rare way of making sound feel human, that her playing carried weight, memory, soul. Once she had walked across stages under lights that warmed rather than judged, but life had narrowed those paths into corridors, first into part-time work, then into full-time necessity, and then into something even smaller. Days scheduled around medical appointments, nights wrapped around exhaustion, dreams folded carefully so they would not get in the way. Still, she never stopped playing. Not because anyone asked her to, not because stages called her back, but because not playing felt like erasing the last part of herself that still remembered who she could have been. On Tuesday nights, after finishing a shift at the Community Arts Center where she cataloged instruments no one knew she could play, she slipped into an old practice room at the end of the hallway, its door always left just slightly ajar, like a secret that refused to close completely. The piano inside was uneven and scarred, ivory chipped in 2 places, one key stubbornly softer than the rest, but to her it was a witness, a constant companion that did not measure her worth against bank statements or invitations. More than once, as she played late into the quiet, someone had paused outside the door. Most passed by without looking in, but one man, the doorman from her building, Mr. Alvarez, who greeted strangers by name, yet went unseen at every event he guarded, had stopped and listened, his hands resting atop a small paper coffee cup, as if even warmth did not entirely belong to him. The first time he heard her, he had not knocked or applauded or intruded. He had simply waited until the music faded, then said softly, "Some rooms get smaller when you step into them, but when you play, the world stands up a little straighter." He never tried to flatter her, never tried to romanticize the fact that excellence could vanish so easily when the world decided not to look at it. Instead, he treated her music the way people treat truth, with quiet, careful reverence. He became, without trying to, the only person who saw her as something other than a background figure in someone else's life. That afternoon, as she prepared to leave for the gala, where she would eventually be summoned to the piano like an intruder to a crime scene, he had stood by the lobby entrance, shoulders slightly rounded from a lifetime of politely shrinking himself. "You're heading somewhere important tonight," he had said, not because of her dress, which was simple and worn at the seams, but because he sensed the particular courage it takes to walk into rooms that have already decided who you are before you arrive. She had smiled faintly and adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. A thin, silver circle, old and nearly faded, the only thing her mother had managed to keep from their earlier years. It was not expensive, and did not want to be. It was a reminder, a small symbol of the life they had survived together, the kind that does not shine under chandeliers, but stays warm beneath lamps. Every time she touched it, she remembered evenings when her mother would sit by the window and listen to her practice, closing her eyes, not because she was tired, but because the music gave her permission to rest. "Whatever they ask of you," Mr. Alvarez had said, his voice low enough that it carried more weight than volume, "remember that rooms like that are not bigger than you. They are only louder." She thanked him, not because she believed she would be safe, but because it mattered that someone believed she deserved to be seen. And yet, even with those words anchored in her chest, the truth remained. She was not walking into that ballroom as a guest of honor. She was walking into it with overdue notices tucked into her purse, with appointment reminders on her phone, with a hospital calling her patient strength because they did not have another word for sacrifice. The stakes of that night were larger than embarrassment. If she made a scene, there would be consequences. Fewer hours available at work, fewer favors from fragile networks of support, fewer people willing to pretend they did not see where she came from. If she stayed silent, there would be other consequences. Smaller, maybe, but deeper, the kind that take root inside the ribs and whisper that disappearing is safer than existing. She had learned to live between those two costs, paying pieces of herself slow enough that no one could hear them breaking. That was why, when the woman in red turned the piano into a stage and the room into a coliseum, she recognized the shape of the moment instantly. It was not new. It had simply been polished. And beneath the chandeliers, as 200 faces waited for her to choose between erasure and humiliation, she carried with her the quiet truth that no one in that room wanted to acknowledge. That dignity does not vanish because someone tries to measure it, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is refuse to disappear when the world has already prepared a place for their absence. By the time she returned to the center of the ballroom, it no longer felt like a room at all. It felt like an arena that had been waiting for her long before she arrived, its marble floors transformed into a quiet stage where every breath sharpened into expectation and every gaze turned into judgment. The crowd had drawn closer without seeming to move, tightening into a crescent around the grand piano as though curiosity itself had weight. Conversations thinned into a low electric hum and then vanished entirely, replaced by the metallic hush of anticipation. The kind people pretend is respectful, though it is really hunger disguised as interest. A woman lifted her phone a little higher, the red recording light blinking like an omen, and another guest whispered that someone had already started a live stream, that more people were watching now than were actually present in the room. The words fluttered through the air like moths drawn to the brightest cruelty they could find. The ballroom lights dimmed a fraction, not by design, but by perception. Because once a spectacle has been declared, even light learns where to look. The woman in red positioned herself just far enough away to claim innocence, and just close enough to claim authorship, her hand resting lightly on the piano lid as though she owned both the instrument and the moment. Her smile returned, composed and predatory, but beneath its composure was the faintest crack, a hesitation no one else noticed, a small tightening around the eyes, as she studied the calm in the other woman's face and wondered, for the smallest fraction of a second, whether she had misjudged what she had summoned. Then the mask sealed itself again. "Let's not keep anyone waiting," she said sweetly, as if patience were a courtesy she had generously extended. The guests leaned forward, shoulders angled, jaws set in polite fascination. They weren't gathered to hear whether there was music in this woman's hands. They were gathered to hear whether there was failure in her body. Someone whispered that the clip was already circulating with captions about entitlement and overstepping, that comments were piling beneath a video taken less than seconds ago by people who had never breathed the same air as her, yet had already decided who she was. The idea that strangers too had been invited into this humiliation tightened the air further, turning the moment into a spectacle that could not be undone. It was not enough for the room to watch. The world now demanded a seat. The woman in black could feel the tension gathering around her ribs like a rope, each breath a negotiation between fear and resolve. In the silence, memory rose like a tide. Her mother's tired hands, the hospital corridor, the unanswered bills, and alongside those memories came others. A practice room filled with lamplight, sheet music bent at the corners, the sound of her younger self believing in something larger than survival. For a heartbeat, she could hear both worlds at once, the world that tried to shrink her and the world that once felt wide enough to hold her. The realization came with a clarity that struck through her chest like a soft and terrible truth. If she walked away now, it would not just be the room that forgot her. It would be the part of herself that still remembered. And if she stepped forward and failed, she would lose something different. Her privacy, her dignity, the fragile anonymity that had protected her from becoming a story other people used to prove their own certainty. The cost was unbearable either way, yet the silence around her insisted that one must be paid. A man in the front row adjusted his cufflinks and murmured that he almost felt sorry for her. His companion said quietly that no, this was necessary, that some people needed to be reminded of limits. The words landed like pebbles against stone, not heavy enough to shatter, just persistent enough to erode. Another voice drifted through the hush, someone laughing softly that this was high society theater, that it was harmless, that she would learn and move on. The woman in black closed her eyes for half a second, and in that darkness she saw her mother's bracelet against her wrist, saw the doorman's quiet nod from earlier, saw every room in which she had been told she was permitted to enter only if she carried her worth like an apology. The thought that echoed through her body was not dramatic and not loud. It was steady, small, and absolute. If I stay silent here, I will disappear everywhere. When she opened her eyes again, the woman in red caught the flicker of something unexpected. Not defiance, not fear, but resolve. It unsettled her, enough that her fingers curled for a moment against the polished piano lid, enough that the corners of her lips wavered before she regained control. It was gone almost instantly, that fragile tremor of doubt, but it had existed, a hairline crack in the certainty she had worn like armor. The guests did not see it, but the doorman at the edge of the ballroom did. His breath hitched, and he stood straighter, as though he had just glimpsed a truth no one else was ready to recognize. The room leaned closer still. Phones hovered like lanterns. The hush turned cavernous, deep and echoing, a silence full of expectation and threat. The woman in red spoke again, her tone lighter now, almost playful, but sharpened underneath. "We're all waiting," she said, and the crowd reacted with a ripple of breath, a wave of anticipation that felt like a tide about to break. The woman in black took one step toward the piano. It was such a small movement, barely more than the adjustment of balance, yet the room shifted around it like architecture under tension. The step was not bold, it was not theatrical, it was simply chosen, and that alone made it dangerous, because it meant she was not being pushed, not being dragged, not being cornered into submission. She was walking, of her own will, toward the thing that had been placed in front of her as a trap, toward the thing that had once been a promise. A murmur trembled through the crowd, not loud, not obvious, but sharp with unease. The woman in red tilted her chin and forced another smile, but there was something tight behind it now. Expectation curdled into caution. And in that fragile sliver of time, suspended between step and action, between silence and sound, between being forgotten and being seen, the room understood, without knowing how or why, that whatever happened next would not simply entertain them. It would expose them. She rested her hand on the edge of the piano, not in plea, not in tremor, but with the gentle familiarity of someone greeting an old friend. The hush became absolute. Even the chandeliers felt motionless, as if the light itself refused to interfere. And as she drew a breath that steadied not just her body but her history, the world narrowed into a single, irrevocable truth. There was no going back. She didn't lower herself onto the piano bench the way the room expected, cautiously, timidly, like someone approaching a boundary they were never meant to cross. She sat with the quiet assurance of someone returning to a language they had never stopped speaking, her spine lifting as though the weight of the ballroom slid from her shoulders and settled instead into the air between the keys and her breath. For a fleeting moment, the crowd mistook that stillness for hesitation, for fragile nerves strung too tightly across borrowed courage, but the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. She was listening. Listening to the soft hum of the chandelier lights, to the faint echo of shoes shifting against marble, to the breath of 200 people who had come to witness her failure, and were now unknowingly wrapped inside the silence that would hold them accountable for it. When her fingers hovered over the keys, they did not tremble. They remembered. The first note was so soft, it seemed accidental, a ghost of a sound barely touching the room, but it carried through the hush with a clarity that made several people straighten in their seats without realizing why. It was not bravado. It was not defiance. It was truth, and truth rarely announces itself loudly. The melody began like a confession beneath candlelight, each tone placed with care, not stretching to impress or to plead for legitimacy, but unfolding the way memory unfolds when it is finally allowed to breathe. The room, which had been braced for clumsiness, for proof that their assumptions were inevitable, found itself suspended instead in something far more unsettling. Curiosity. The woman in red blinked, the confident tilt of her head slipping a fraction as the notes settled into the walls like smoke, refusing to be dismissed as coincidence. Her lips parted as if to laugh, as if to regain control with a casual remark, but nothing left her mouth. Even her certainty felt suddenly fragile. Measure by measure, the music deepened, the melody drawing itself inward before rising again with a quiet command that belonged not to the room, not to the piano, not even to her, but to the years that had shaped the space between her hands and the world. Her wrists loosened, her shoulders softened. She was no longer performing. She was remembering the parts of herself that had never been given permission to speak in daylight. Some listeners leaned forward unconsciously, their faces shifting from amusement into concentration, the way people look when they realize they are hearing something they do not yet have the language to describe. The woman in red stiffened, as if an invisible thread had tightened around her ribs. She tried to fold her expression back into superiority, but her eyes betrayed something small and sharp, unease. Then it happened. The moment the room had been waiting for, the stumble that would justify everything. A brief slip of timing, a fragile hesitation between two notes that should have landed seamlessly, but instead wavered in midair like a misstep at the edge of a cliff. A murmur fluttered through the audience like a breath released too early. A glitter of anticipation returned to the phones lifted toward her. A man near the back whispered, "There it is." The woman in red's smile resurfaced, triumphant, premature, the satisfaction of someone who believed the world had snapped neatly back into place. But she did not flinch. She did not freeze. She did not break. Instead, she leaned into the mistake, pressed deeper into the phrase as if she had chosen to arrive there on purpose, and reshaped the moment with a grace so deliberate it rewrote the silence around her. The hesitation transformed not into collapse, but into vulnerability that bled into strength, a fragile breath that made the next swell of sound ache with something raw and unmistakably human. And something in the room shifted, sharply, permanently, as the crowd realized they were no longer listening for failure. They were listening because they could not look away. The left hand surged into fuller resonance, grounding the melody with a richness that filled the marble floor from beneath, while the right hand lifted into brightness, carrying phrases upward like light slipping across glass at dawn. The instrument woke beneath her, its tone expanding with each passage until even the chandeliers seemed to vibrate in sympathy. The music did not ask to be accepted. It commanded presence. It revealed what the woman in red could not hide behind etiquette or laughter, that power, stripped of spectacle, is simply noise, and excellence does not negotiate with it. Eyes that had once searched her for weakness now searched the music for explanation. A senator who had smirked earlier lowered his phone. A young woman near the aisle pressed a fist against her mouth without realizing she'd done it. The doorman at the edge of the room closed his eyes for a brief, reverent moment, as if witnessing a prophecy he had always known would arrive. The piece crescendoed into a passage that would have broken lesser hands, rapid runs of sound weaving themselves into a storm of precision and control. And still she did not play with arrogance or theatrical triumph. She played like someone who understood that beauty did not erase pain, but exposed the way it had shaped her. The music swelled, then narrowed again into a quiet so intimate it made the audience feel suddenly unworthy of hearing it. The woman in red's breathing quickened, a faint tightness gathering at her throat as the realization settled into her posture like a cold tide. This moment no longer belonged to her. It never had. What had begun as a test had become a mirror. The final passage rose through the ballroom like a declaration without anger, fierce not in volume but in honesty, carrying with it every hour in the hospital, every unopened envelope, every room she had been asked to leave quietly, transmuted now into sound that refused to bow. And when the last note landed, it did not crash. It settled. It lingered. It held the room still in a silence so complete it was almost unbearable. A silence not of judgment, not of discomfort, but of awe that did not yet know how to speak. For a heartbeat, no one moved, not because they chose restraint, but because they had forgotten how to perform disbelief. 200 people stood suspended between what they had expected to see and what they had just been forced to acknowledge. The woman in red's hand slipped from the edge of the piano. Her smile had vanished entirely now, replaced by something unfamiliar and unsteady. The dawning knowledge that she had not orchestrated a spectacle. She had revealed herself, and in that fragile, breathless pause, before applause remembered how to exist, before cameras remembered they were recording, before the room could decide whether to rewrite what it had witnessed, one undeniable truth hung above them like a weight they could not duck beneath. The humiliation they had prepared no longer belonged to her. The first sound to break the silence was not applause, but breath. A collective, fragile exhale that rippled through the ballroom like a confession, as if 200 people had suddenly realized they had been holding their lungs hostage to their own expectations, and now that those expectations had shattered, they no longer knew what to do with the air they were given back. Then a single pair of hands came together, hesitant at first, then certain. Not loud, not theatrical, but reverent. And the applause spread outward like a tide that had finally found its shoreline, rising until the marble floor trembled beneath the weight of recognition the room had never intended to give. People stood without realizing they were standing. Some did so slowly, as if trying to reconcile the arrogance they had carried into the moment with the humility demanded of them now, while others rose instantly, pulled upward by something older and deeper than pride. The doorman by the column, the man who had watched quietly, who had believed quietly, was the first to step forward, his hands shaking as he clapped, not for performance, but for truth finally spoken aloud. His gaze met hers for a fleeting second, and in that unguarded moment, the distance between their worlds collapsed, not because the room had changed, but because it no longer had the right to decide who belonged in it. The woman in red did not move at first. She stood frozen beside the piano like a statue carved out of disbelief, the applause crashing around her, while the certainty she had worn like armor dissolved into something brittle and exposed. Her smile, so carefully engineered throughout the evening, had abandoned her completely, leaving only the bare, unvarnished expression of someone who had mistaken control for power and cruelty for authority, and was now realizing that both had deserted her in the one moment she needed them most. She tried to recover, to lift her chin, to reclaim the posture of dominance that had shaped the night. But every attempt collapsed beneath the weight of the room's reversal, because no one was looking at her anymore. The gravity had shifted. The spotlight, invisible yet undeniable, no longer belonged to the woman who had orchestrated humiliation. It belonged to the woman who had refused to exist on anyone else's terms. Invitations emerged from the audience like white flags. quiet offers spoken through awe rather than pity. A gallery patron approached with trembling politeness to ask whether she performed publicly. A conservatory board member murmured something about opportunity, about auditions, about doors that had suddenly discovered hinges where walls used to be. None of these people had seen her before tonight, not because she was invisible, but because they had never bothered to look. Now they could not unsee her, and for the first time, she did not try to shrink beneath their attention. She did not apologize for standing at the center of the room. She did not bow like a guest grateful for borrowed presence. She simply breathed, and in that breath was the quiet, irreversible shift of someone who had stepped out of a cage she had never agreed to live in. The doorman reached her first, moving through the crowd not as an intruder, but as a witness whose place had finally been acknowledged. He didn't praise her loudly, didn't speak in grand gestures or soaring words. He simply touched the edge of the piano and said softly, "I told you. Some rooms only feel big until the right person stands up in them." His voice trembled, not because he doubted, but because he knew exactly how many years had been buried beneath this moment. She smiled, small, human, unguarded, and for a heartbeat the applause softened, not in volume, but in texture, as if the room itself understood that the first recognition did not belong to power, or to status, or to people who had just now decided to celebrate her. It belonged to the one who had already seen her. Cameras captured everything, not as weapons anymore, but as reluctant witnesses to a transformation that refused to be edited into something safer. People who had raised their phones to document humiliation now lowered them in shame, or lifted them again, this time not to mock, but to remember. The woman in red finally found her voice, though when she spoke it sounded smaller than it ever had, stripped of the confidence that once made it ring like polished glass. She tried to step closer, to reclaim the illusion that this moment still belonged to her, to frame it as generous, as accidental, as a misunderstanding she could redefine. But the crowd parted without being asked, not aggressively, not cruelly, simply naturally, the way people step aside when a truth larger than them needs space to stand. Her authority did not crumble in a dramatic collapse. It dissolved in silence. People averted their eyes when she looked to them for reassurance. Friends who had once hovered around her now drifted to the edges of the room, as if proximity to her no longer felt like privilege, but like implication. Her power, so loudly worn, so easily exercised, no longer had an audience willing to applaud it. And that, more than humiliation, was what hollowed her center. The woman at the piano did not turn toward her. She did not confront her, did not demand apology or vindication or acknowledgement. She did not need to. The reversal had already taken place, not in words, not in spectacle, but in the simple, undeniable fact that for the first time in that ballroom, the room's worth was measured not by who owned it, but by who had earned the right to be heard inside it. Something inside her shifted then, deeply, quietly, not a surge of pride, not triumph, but recognition. For years she had carried herself as someone borrowing space from the world, taking care not to disturb the furniture of power. Now, standing where she had once been summoned as an example, she felt the center of gravity move somewhere inward, somewhere steady. She no longer needed the room to accept her. She accepted herself. The applause swelled again, not louder but fuller, as if the sound itself understood that it was no longer celebrating performance, but bearing witness to a release. And in the midst of that rising sound, with the woman in red shrinking into the anonymity she had tried to impose on others, and with the crowd seeing, truly seeing, the person they had so eagerly underestimated, one lingering truth settled gently over the marble and glass. She had not won anything. She had simply reclaimed what had always been hers, and the cage the room had built for her, the one crafted from politeness and assumption and quiet cruelty, did not crack or splinter or break. It vanished. By the time the ballroom emptied and the night folded itself into the quiet hours where cities breathe differently, the story had already begun to outrun the room that created it. The recording, shaky at first, framed an expectation of humiliation, did not spread because people wanted to laugh. It spread because they did not know how to forget what they had seen. By dawn, the video had crossed oceans and languages, traveling from phone to phone like a rumor that refused to dissolve, gathering captions not of mockery, but of disbelief. Not disbelief that she had played beautifully, but disbelief that anyone had ever thought she did not belong. Headlines did not scream. They whispered, which was somehow louder. The woman at the piano. Dignity in silence. When a room misjudges the wrong person. Institutions that had once overlooked applications with quiet bureaucratic courtesy now searched frantically for contact details. A university conservatory wrote to say her file had been reconsidered under new review. A festival director reached out with an invitation written in language so reverent it almost apologized for arriving late to belief. And beneath all that public noise, where the story mattered most, another message arrived first. The hospital's automated tone, followed by a voice that sounded lighter than it ever had, explaining that an anonymous donor had cleared the outstanding balance and scheduled treatment without delay. She didn't cry right away. She sat at the edge of the bed and held her mother's hand while the early sun traced a thin golden line across the window frame, and the silence between them felt full, not heavy, not fearful, full. The doorman heard before she told him. Someone had shown him the video in the early morning, and he had watched from the lobby desk with his hand pressed over his mouth, stunned not by the music, he had always known, but by the fact that the world had finally been forced to see what had existed in plain sight. When she stepped through the glass doors later that day, he didn't greet her with congratulations or awe. He simply bowed his head slightly and said, "Now they finally caught up." It was not triumph. It was restoration. Opportunities did not arrive like gifts. They arrived like bridges, steady, deliberate, extended by people who were suddenly aware that they had been standing on one side of a river, pretending the other bank did not exist. A foundation offered a residency that came with something rarer than prestige: time. A recording studio sent a letter not filled with promises of fame, but with a single, startling acknowledgement. We would be honored if your first public work belonged entirely to you. She accepted only what did not ask her to erase the path she had taken to get here. And through each conversation, each invitation, each possibility stretching outward, like new terrain she was no longer afraid to walk, Mr. Alvarez remained nearby in the way witnesses do, appearing in small moments, asking nothing, reminding her with his quiet steadiness that this story did not begin in the ballroom and did not end on a screen. Meanwhile, the woman in red discovered that the price of cruelty does not come in shouts or scandal. It arrives in distance. Board members who had once admired her confidence now hesitated before aligning their names beside hers. Sponsorship committees postponed decisions. Event planners removed her from programs for strategic optics. No one humiliated her. No one retaliated. The room she had once controlled simply stopped revolving when she entered, and for the first time in her life, she felt what it meant to stand in a space without gravity. It was not punishment. It was consequence. Quiet, systemic, unyielding. Not because the world had turned against her, but because it could no longer pretend not to see what she had revealed about herself when she tried to turn another person into a spectacle. Months later, in a hall not gilded but grand, not ostentatious but honest, she stood again beside a piano, not as an exhibit, not as a test, but as a musician stepping onto a stage that recognized her name before she spoke it. The audience was not made of elites performing admiration. It was made of people who had walked through their own small humiliations, who understood the delicate ache of being judged before being known, who saw in her not a miracle, but a mirror. Somewhere in the third row stood the doorman, wearing a suit that fit him awkwardly and pride that fit him perfectly, and when she caught sight of him, her breath steadied the same way it had in the ballroom. But this time, the steadiness came not from defiance, from belonging. Her mother rested in a reserved seat at the aisle, recovery softened across her features like dawn across water, one hand gently touching the thin silver bracelet that now gleamed under the lights without needing to compete with them. And as she sat at the instrument, this time not to prove, not to survive, but simply to speak, the space around her felt different. It did not loom. It opened. She played not as a rebuttal to the night she'd been summoned like an inconvenience, but as a continuation of the truth that had risen from it, that excellence does not require permission, that dignity is not conditional, that a room's judgment holds no power over a soul that has already refused to disappear. When the final note faded, the applause that followed did not explode. It blossomed. It lived. It lingered. And as she rose from the bench, lifting her eyes not to the lights, not to the ceiling, but to the people who had waited years for a story like this to exist in the world, she understood the full circle she had walked. Once she had been kept from touching the instrument, as if it were a symbol she was not allowed to approach. Now, she did not just step toward it. She carried it with her. The story did not end with triumph. It ended with recognition. Of every person who has ever stood in a room that decided their worth before hearing their voice. Of every witness who believed quietly until the world was forced to listen. Of every life that holds brilliance the world refuses to notice, until it can no longer pretend not to see. Excellence had always been there. Only now, the world finally saw it.